Enough noise. Quiet down already. I was enjoying life with my husband and my kind mother-in-law, but things changed after our daughter was born. He started yelling at our crying daughter and me, treating us coldly. One day, while my husband was busy with work at home, our daughter suddenly started crying loudly, but then, in a moment, when I looked away, she quietly fell asleep. However, it turned out she wasn't just sleeping. When she woke up, she started having seizures. After taking her to the emergency hospital and hearing the doctor's diagnosis, I decided to divorce him when I got home. My name is Mia. I'm a 28-year-old housewife. I live with my husband Cody, our daughter Emily, and my mother-in-law Susan. I met him 6 years ago at our previous workplace. We were in the same cohort, working in the planning department. From the beginning, I was impressed by his innovative ideas, which seemed beyond a new employee's level, and I became curious about him. Different from other colleagues, he didn't mingle much and seemed a bit of an oddball. But when I approached him, I found his quirks interesting. For instance, he loved brainstorming for projects. So to avoid lunch indecision, he set a weekly routine. Curry on Monday, ramen on Tuesday, hamburger combo on Wednesday, and so on. So his solitary dining wasn't about avoiding others. It was about maintaining his routine. And I found it easy to join him for lunch. Our conversations were often work-related, but they were insightful and enjoyable. He had other workaholic quirks, but I found them endearing. I like you. It was me who confessed my feelings first. Me too, he smiled and responded. Our relationship didn't change much after we became a couple. We didn't go on typical romantic dates. Instead, we ate lunch together and discussed project ideas. It was only after we started dating that he introduced me to his mom. Busy with work, he didn't have time for house chores and lived with his mom. From what I heard, his family background was complicated. His parents divorced when he was 10. He stayed with his mom, and his newborn sister went with their dad. He had no contact with his dad and sister after that. Initially, I was wary, thinking his mom might be overly protective, but she turned out to be very nice. Unlike her reserved son, she was sociable and treated me just as kindly as she treated her son. We often went out together, leaving my busy husband behind. Things were going great with both him and his mom. 3 years into our relationship, after accepting his proposal, "If Cody's getting married, I guess I'll have to move out," I was jokingly told by his mother. That would be a problem. I accepted the proposal, looking forward to living with you. If you're okay with it, please stay with us, I eagerly replied. Susan laughed and said, "Are you sure about that? I might end up pestering you, you know." Her cheerful expression and smile were infectious. I laughed too, saying, "Let's be bold about it." My husband, watching us, also smiled. For the next 2 years, we lived without any issues. Susan took on all the household chores for us, a working couple, even though I offered to help. "Don't worry, you must be tired," she'd say, handling everything herself. On weekends, when my husband was cooped up in his room with work, it was fun to cook and bake with Susan. I think our home remained bright and joyful thanks to Susan being there, especially with my workaholic husband, and I was grateful. Everything changed when I found out I was pregnant. 2 years into our marriage, feeling unwell, I visited the hospital on Susan's suggestion and discovered I was pregnant. My husband was overjoyed when I told them, but Susan's reaction wasn't as enthusiastic as I expected. Usually, she was the one who celebrated our family's happy news the most, so her reaction seemed odd. That night, in our bedroom, I asked my husband about it.
Mom got postpartum depression after my sister was born. Dad was away on a long business trip, and she struggled alone, taking care of me and my sister. One day, she left with just me. I haven't seen my sister or dad since.
He revealed. I regretted my thoughtlessness, not knowing about Susan's past. Had I known, I would have told my husband first and been more considerate about how he told Susan. Seeing me upset, my husband smiled and said,
"But it's been nearly 20 years since then. Mom will be fine."
He encouraged me. He was right. From the next day, Susan was her usual self, maybe even more caring than before. She paid extra attention to my diet to ensure I got all the nutrients and even accompanied me to doctor's appointments in place of my husband. Feeling reassured by Susan, I decided to give birth here instead of going back to my parents' house. Initially, I thought of delivering at my parents' in the countryside, but it seemed too cumbersome to find a hospital there and prepare for the move. Luckily, Susan said, "I'll help you." And thanks to her, I had a smooth delivery. I'll never forget when my daughter Emily was born. I loved her while she was in my womb, but seeing her face for the first time made me overflow with love and an unspoken vow to protect and make her happy no matter what. Both my husband and Susan were thrilled about Emily's birth, and it felt like the happiest time of my life. However, that happiness gradually began to crumble. After bringing our daughter home from the hospital, I took a year off under FMLA, intending to help with childcare and household chores.
"I'll take care of the house as usual. Don't worry about it,"
Susan insisted. True to her word, Susan continued to take care of everything, as she always had, but she avoided any involvement with our daughter. It felt like she was deliberately keeping her distance. Normally attentive to everything I said, Susan would give vague responses or pretend not to hear when I talked about our daughter. I was saddened by Susan's behavior towards our daughter, but knowing her past, I couldn't press the issue. 6 months after our daughter's birth, Susan's attitude hadn't changed. By then, our daughter could perfectly recognize faces and had started to smile at her dad, even though he couldn't spend much time with her due to work. My husband, still prioritizing work, was delighted that she was responding to him when he did find time to interact. Around this time, our daughter began to cry a lot at night. Not having much experience with other children, I thought she cried more than usual. She would wake up and cry for 2 to 3 hours straight. I tried to soothe her in the living room or bathroom to avoid disturbing my husband and Susan, but in our not-so-large house, the sound was inescapable.
"Last night was noisy."
I increasingly heard such remarks from both my husband and Susan. While it was one thing to hear it from my husband, Susan was someone who seldom complained. I think this was the first time she ever did. Despite my efforts, our daughter's night crying continued unabated. Gradually, both my husband and Susan seemed to become more irritated.
"Noise! Make her quiet."
Their requests became increasingly harsh. That year, an important planning meeting was scheduled at my husband's company. Whether his proposal was accepted at this meeting would determine if he would be assigned a project for the next fiscal year. My husband was working on a proposal for that meeting, bringing his work home in addition to the office. Knowing the significance of this meeting, I planned to stay at my parents' house for 2 nights and 3 days, starting 2 days before the meeting, to ensure I didn't disturb my husband's preparation. It was my way of making sure his work wasn't disrupted by our daughter's nighttime crying. but things didn't go as planned. In fact, I ended up going to my parents' house even earlier than I intended. With less than a week until my husband's presentation, he was working on his proposal at home. I had plans to go out that day to avoid disturbing him, but it was pouring rain. As I don't drive, I hesitated to go out with my daughter, fearing she would catch a cold in the December rain. Reluctantly staying home, I tried even harder than usual to keep my daughter from crying. However, she suddenly started crying for no apparent reason. She had just been fed, and her diaper was clean. I was playing with her when she started crying, and I couldn't understand why. Desperate to keep her cries from reaching my husband, I moved to the bathroom, the farthest spot from the bedroom where he was working, and tried my best to soothe her. Still, she wouldn't stop crying. Then my husband opened the bedroom door and yelled, "Enough noise! Quiet down already!" It was a harsh way to speak, unthinkable from the man I married, but this had become typical lately. I understood work was important, but his tone was unnecessary. Despite my efforts, my daughter started crying, and then I was scolded by my husband. Why is it always me? I felt like crying too. But I thought, once his work calmed down, he'd return to normal. And eventually our daughter would stop crying. I held back my tears and decided to feed her more milk, thinking it might help her sleep if her stomach was full. Unfortunately, as I couldn't breastfeed, I had to boil water and prepare the formula. I couldn't leave her in the bathroom while I did this, so I took her to the living room and laid her in the baby bed. As she continued to cry, Susan, who was in the living room, frowned and said, "When will she stop crying? Cody can't concentrate on his work, and I can't stand the noise." Recently, this had been typical of Susan, too. She did her household duties and talked to me, but she wouldn't touch or say anything nice about my daughter. I apologized to Susan and asked her to watch my daughter for a moment. I rushed to the kitchen to make milk. Even then, I could hear my daughter's shrill scream like crying. But as soon as the water cooled and the milk was ready, the crying stopped abruptly. I knew it. Susan must have calmed her down, I thought, feeling grateful. When I returned to the living room, sure enough, my daughter was asleep. Susan was sitting on the sofa reading a book. I thanked her, saying, "You're amazing, Susan. Experience in parenting really makes a difference." "Sure." But her response was lukewarm. I felt slightly uneasy about Susan's reaction, but relieved that I hadn't disturbed my husband, I didn't dwell on it. However, my daughter didn't wake up, even after 3 hours. I worried she wouldn't sleep at night and start crying again, so I decided to wake her up. However, my daughter didn't respond to my calls. While I gently tapped her shoulder, she opened her eyes but seemed unfocused and dazed. She appeared different from her usual sleepy self, which made me worried. I told Susan about my daughter's unusual condition and sought her advice, but Susan hardly looked at her and said, "It's probably nothing. She'll be fine." I wanted to believe Susan's words, but my daughter's eyes remained unfocused. Frightened, I went to my husband, who was working in the bedroom. "I know you're busy, but can you drive us? Something's wrong with Emily. She's lethargic and acting strange. I'm worried and want to go to the hospital, please." That's how I appealed desperately. But my husband, visibly annoyed, said, "Isn't it just your imagination? What did Mom say?" "Susan thinks it's fine, but it's clearly not okay." "If Mom says it's fine, then it should be. I need to finish this today. Don't bother me." "But I'm worried." To that, my husband yelled,
Enough. Can't you see I'm working? I thought she had finally stopped crying, and now you want to go to the hospital? Don't be ridiculous."
Stunned by his outburst, I couldn't reply. Then he turned back to his computer and muttered,
"I wish we never had a child."
Those words of my husband still echo in my ears. I couldn't believe it. It was unthinkable for him to say such a thing, but I saw and heard him say it clearly. I was in shock, unable to stop crying. I never imagined my husband would say something like that. I couldn't stop crying even after leaving the bedroom, but seeing my daughter made my tears stop. She was having a seizure. Something was wrong. She had been fine earlier, not appearing ill at all. In a panic, I called a taxi and rushed her to the emergency room. The thought of something happening to her made me tremble uncontrollably. Upon arrival, a pediatrician immediately examined her.
"There's a possibility of shaken baby syndrome,"
he said, and a CT scan was scheduled. I didn't know about the condition, so I looked it up in the waiting room, learning that it occurs when a baby's undeveloped neck muscles are shaken violently, causing brain damage. In severe cases, it can be fatal. I was too shocked to think straight. After some time, I was called in to discuss the results.
"Fortunately, Emily has no hematoma, and we've administered anticonvulsant medication, so she's calmer now,"
the doctor said, which relieved me. But then he said something unbelievable.
"However, Mrs. Mia, when the nurse undressed Emily for the examination, we found marks on her neck and shoulders, resembling adult finger marks. I don't mean to offend, but has there been any abuse towards your daughter?"
I couldn't comprehend what he was suggesting.
"The shaken baby syndrome is caused by vigorously shaking an infant. It can happen accidentally while trying to soothe or during lifting. We initially thought it might have been accidental, but seeing those marks, it's possible someone intentionally shook her with considerable force."
The doctor explained calmly.
"If you can't recall doing it, perhaps a family member. It's a relief we caught it early, and there's no hematoma. But if it happens again, Emily might not be so lucky. You should have a thorough talk with your family."
The doctor's words haunted me after leaving the consultation room. I never abused my daughter, nor had I seen any marks of abuse on her. There were no marks when I changed her diaper or clothes earlier. It seemed likely that Susan did something while I was making the milk. Emily was to be hospitalized for observation for 3 days, so I returned home to gather necessary items. "Susan, did you do something to Emily?" I asked, trembling. Then, "I didn't do anything. Why?" Susan reacted defensively. Typically. "What happened? Is something wrong?" Susan would have inquired, but she denied any knowledge without asking further. "Please, tell me the truth," I urged. Finally, Susan admitted. "I just shook her a bit because she was too noisy, nothing more." "That's not just a bit. The doctor said there were severe marks on her neck and shoulders. You almost caused serious harm to Emily by shaking her," I exclaimed. "Well, she's fine, isn't she? So what's the issue?" Susan replied nonchalantly. "How can you say that?" I shouted. At that moment, my husband emerged from the bedroom.
"Can you keep it down? You're being too loud."
He snapped and slammed the door. I had messaged him about Emily's seizure and taking her to the hospital, yet he didn't even ask about her condition and only complained about the noise. Susan showing no remorse for putting my daughter through such an ordeal? I thought we had a good relationship, but it turned out not to be the case. That moment, I lost all hope in them and decided to leave. I quickly gathered the hospital and my personal belongings and left the house. Fortunately, I had planned to return to my parents' house, so I grabbed the travel bags that were already packed. In the taxi heading to the hospital where my daughter was, I decided to get a divorce. It might seem like an overreaction, but for me, it was a major issue. My anger towards Susan's actions was one thing, but the main cause was my husband's behavior. I understand his job is demanding, and the upcoming planning meeting could greatly affect his workload for the next fiscal year. However, that doesn't justify neglecting our daughter's emergency hospital visit and admission. It's not a life or death job, and he's not the only one who can do it. It's about whether he becomes a project leader or an assistant. Yet he didn't even ask about our daughter's condition or come to the hospital. 3 days after her admission, Emily was discharged safely. I decided to divorce my husband and went straight to my parents' house instead of returning home. Since my husband and Susan expected me to be at my parents' house that day, they didn't contact me. At my parents' house, I told them everything that had happened. My mom hugged my daughter and me, crying, and my dad, after slamming his fist on the table, said,
"Don't go back there. Stay with us. I'll protect you both."
I cried at his words. Then we started researching divorce. As lay people, it seemed challenging, especially as Susan's actions didn't constitute continuous abuse. If my husband contested the divorce, it looked like it would be difficult to proceed, even with mediation. So I decided to set a trap. 3 days later,
"The presentation went well. Come back home. Let's celebrate. It was a success."
my husband messaged me. Angry at his nonchalant attitude, I decided to return home to discuss the divorce. I left Emily with my mom, not wanting her to meet my husband and Susan again. When I returned home alone, my husband was surprised.
"Where's Emily? Still in the hospital? Is she that sick?"
And he mentioned Emily for the first time. Emily's been discharged. She's at my parents' house now.
"Why didn't you bring her back?"
I want a divorce. Both my husband and Susan were shocked.
"What?"
Emily was lucky this time, but what if Susan had shaken her more violently? If I hadn't noticed and left it unattended, Emily might not have survived. I'm scared of Susan, and I was about to point out my husband's faults when he interrupted me.
"If you're scared of Mom, we can live separately. Please reconsider the divorce."
At his words, Susan reacted. "What? You choose Emily over me?" And she confronted my husband. Ignoring Susan's protests, my husband said,
"Then it's settled, isn't it?"
I continued, "No, I'm also disappointed in you, Cody. I can't believe you said we never should have had a child, and that you prioritized work over our daughter's life. Whether or not you separate from Susan, I can only think of divorce." He grabbed my hand, pleading.
"No, I was overwhelmed with work at that time. I love you. And Emily, please don't talk about divorce. I apologize."
I believe the words and actions that come out in moments of pressure reveal true feelings. I can't trust you anymore.
"I won't let you go, even if it means going to mediation."
His words shook me. If it went to mediation, it could be problematic for me. As I had learned at my parents' house, proving Susan's actions as abuse and using it as grounds for divorce would be difficult. So I decided to use a lie I thought of at the moment. "I don't mind going to mediation, but you should be prepared that Susan might get arrested for abuse."
"What do you mean, abuse?"
Susan approached me angry and unrecognizable from the Susan I once knew. I was suspected of abuse at the hospital. I explained I didn't do it, and I have a medical report. I also have photos of the marks on Emily's neck. If I can prove these marks came from Susan, it'll establish abuse. If Cody insists on mediation, I'll submit these. In reality, this method had little legal strength. Even if proved, a one-time incident might not be considered abuse. However, they believed it.
Please reconsider. I can't get arrested.
I won't reconsider. And if you go to mediation, I'll make sure it's scheduled on a weekday. Can you prioritize us over your important job? My husband hesitated at this. Susan said to my husband,
Cody, please agree to the divorce. I don't want to get arrested.
And she kept pleading. My husband stayed silent, deep in thought. Then, as a final push, I said, I will use any means to divorce you, even if it goes to mediation and Susan gets arrested. It will just mean you'll have to take time off work. Our divorce will still happen. If you're okay with that, then please go ahead. After some silence, my husband reluctantly agreed to the divorce. During discussions about property distribution and child support, he repeatedly asked,
Is this a lie? Won't you reconsider?
I ignored all his pleas. Eventually, we agreed on splitting the property in half and a child support of $400 a month. My husband hesitated until the very end, but finally signed the divorce papers, realizing my stance was unwavering. Once I confirmed his signature and ensured there were no errors. Feel free to dispose of all my belongings. I don't want to take anything from this house, I told him. I had no desire to bring anything from that house to my new life. My parents' house had furniture, and I didn't want to remember anything associated with that house. As I was leaving,
It's all your fault, right? Cody, you said you didn't want the child too. It's your fault. What? I covered for you so you wouldn't get arrested. If you hadn't done that, we wouldn't have needed to go to the hospital, and I wouldn't have been blamed. It's all your fault, not Mia's. It's you who should leave.
I heard my husband and Susan arguing. Later, I heard rumors that my husband and Susan separated. Apparently, they constantly argued after the incident, each blaming the other for the divorce. Susan was forced to leave the apartment, which was in my ex-husband's name, and now works in cleaning, taking orders from people much younger than her. A year has passed since then, and my daughter is growing up without any lasting effects. She's starting to talk, calling me Mom, and even saying Grandpa and Grandma. While my mom looks after her, I've rejoined the workforce at a local company, working in the planning department, and like my ex-husband, I prioritize my family over my job. I've heard about my ex-husband's struggles through former colleagues. Unaccustomed to living alone, he couldn't focus on his work, and his project faltered. Eventually, he was removed as project leader and transferred to the Human Resources Department. Ironically, while he was demoted from the planning department, I, who prioritized my family, was assigned to it. My work is going well. I often come up with great ideas while holding my daughter on my lap, resulting in successful project proposals. Also, my personal life is thriving. I've been getting along well with a single father from my workplace. We initially bonded over talks about our children, and now spend weekends together with our kids at parks and amusement parks. His 3-year-old son has taken a liking to me and plays well with my daughter. He treats my daughter kindly, and I hope to continue this relationship. While I'm not considering remarriage just yet, given my recent divorce, I do entertain the thought of becoming his wife someday if things continue to go well between us.